Hi, I'm Sean O'Brady. This is my presentation called Institutions as Worker Power Resources in Advanced Capitalism. This started off as a book chapter that I authored for the book Workers' Power and Society. Some of you may have read it or heard of it already. And I said, hey, I'm going to push it a little further and write a journal article. And at first I thought it'll be simple. I'll just convert some of the ideas. I'll write it in a couple weeks. And I said, hey, Jens and Bjarke, let's all get together and write it together since you guys are up-and-coming power resource theory guys. And then we sat down and had a few meetings, and we realized that there's a heck of a lot that we can do to the paper. And so now it's become a huge mess of ideas. So I'm trying to kind of synthesize certain themes that are going to appear in the new paper as we completely overhaul it. So please tell me what you think. It's very much a work in progress. So obviously capitalism and its power relations are embedded in institutions. Everybody at the CRIMP, most people at the CRIMP run under this premise when they do their research. And institutions matter, and a lot of research points to that. But we argue that how they matter, how and why they matter needs clarification. There's a lot of research out there that shows that institutional power resources matter to struggles, that they're resilient, but they change over time. They have implications for union strategy. They can make unions more inward and less progressive. In other instances, they can make them more progressive and try harder, and they do influence strategy. But there isn't really a paper out there that we found hits at exactly what institutional power is. What is it? How does it work? Do people really know they have it? How do you use it properly? So we're trying to answer these questions. So this paper intends to do 4 things. 1, show how institutional power resources fit into broader literatures on worker power. 2nd, how do these institutions become a power resource? How does that happen? 3rd, how do institutions function as a power resource? I'm going to focus on that more than the other aspects of it in today's presentation. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is how institutions are disrupted and change over time. But I didn't give as much attention as I would have liked, because I know once I do the rest, I'll be at time. So there's 1 slide on it, and ideas after during the hallway discussions or cocktail. So institutional power resources within broad literature. When Walter Korpi began talking about power resources in the late 70s and 80s, there was a scholarly divide even at that time. It was divided between Marxists that focused on how worker power relates to the forces of production, and it talked about the institutionalists, which looked at how institutions structured the interactions between workers and employers. Korpi ended up coming in with this power resource theory to focus on worker power as a causative agent for institutional and societal change. It showed how its mobilization impacted social outcomes in society. His principal preoccupation was on things on welfare regime change, income redistribution. It was not necessarily on how it empowers labor movements. That was obviously part of it, but it's more of how do labor movements use their power to change societies, rather than looking at how the impacts of what they've done when these institutions come about and society has been changed turns back and influences worker power. He had a bit of a reductionist understanding of power resources. He talked a lot about associational power, institutional power resources. He talked about associational power and other power resources, but when he talked about institutions, he treated them more as cost-saving mechanisms. Having them around makes mobilization easier. Obviously, if you have the Ghent system, you have easier access to union members, things like that. But he didn't go in any profound way into how the institutions impact labor movements. More recently, power resources scholars are looking at it. They're looking at institutions from social compromises in the past, even though we have changes in capital institutions that stick around and workers can draw on them to influence worker power. But again, like I say before, there's a lack of theorization on what this means. So one of the things we try to do in the paper is we try to come up with a theoretically useful definition of what constitutes an institution that's going to be useful for us to understand how workers draw on it for power. And we talk about institutional power at institutions as formal rules. And this can be very controversial to some. As an IR scholar, this isn't controversial to me. We look at laws, we look at collective bargaining arrangements, we look at government policies. It's normal to us. But in a business school where I have a lot of sociological institutionalists, they look a lot of institutions kind of as culture. And this is what a lot of the historical institutionalists criticize. we make an emphasis in the paper to say that it's important to focus on formal rules because there's some negative implications to examining institutions and culture as mixed together into one. For example, power resources literature looks at ideational power. Ideational power is related to culture. If you start looking at ideational power as institutions, which some institutionalist literatures kind of conflate the two, then what's the point of isolating what's an institution? Ideas and institutions become the same thing. So we argue that formal rules are very, very important, but that doesn't diminish the importance of everything else. Ideas still matter. The other insights from these other literatures still matter, but it's important to keep that focus. By institutions, as formal rules, we mean governments and laws, collective bargaining arrangements. They can be things institutions do, but as formally sanctioned by third parties. These parties can be the state, which enforces institutions, but it can also be unions and other actors, employers, for example, when they're enforcing collective agreements, like in sectoral bargaining. And the focus is on industrial relations institutions and so on. We have some observations that we think are important drawing attention to when looking at how institutions impact worker power. One of them is that they impact worker power directly and indirectly. I'll give you an example of a direct impact. A direct impact is a works council. A works council in Germany, let's say you want to introduce any kind of AI that is considered as disruptive to a workplace, for example, in a call center and in many places where these works councils exist, they usually have the right, the ability to say a veto. I'm going to stop it from happening. That's a direct link between the institution and the exercise of power. It stops something from happening. In this case, it can be seen as a constraint. It constrains management action in a way that's useful, but it can also be seen as a resource for unions in the sense that they're drawing on the works councils to achieve greater influence in bargaining. Often, there are indirect impacts too. Indirect impacts of an institution doesn't mean it's happening exclusively from direct impacts. Often, both happen at the same time. So this same works council, which can have direct impacts on stopping a manager from doing something through the application of a veto, can also be used to build other power resources. Indirect means when you're using one an institution to build other power resources, building associational power, ideational power, and so on. So an indirect power for a works council would be works councils have greater access to the workplace so they can recruit members. So they're doing something else at the same time. They're helping to build power. And this is important because it has implications. The exercise of power alone can also create reliance effects, which I'll talk about later, where you're using it, but it can replace the need for other ones. Whereas if it's helping you build other power resources, these power resources are capacity building, and they help to build other forms of strength for the union that can be used when institutional power declines. As we see in neoliberalism, right, Bjarke and Howell, there is such a thing as neoliberal decline across many countries, though there's some debates about the extent of it and diversity across countries. There's also what we also point to the importance of compositional effects. These are the fact that different power resources in general in the literature complement each other, they contradict each other. Basically, they interact. So we look at complementarities, which are that using multiple power resources together can increase your power. To go back to the example of a works council, you can use a works council to have a veto. But you could also use, for example, in Germany, workers' rights to be on the supervisory boards, right, in corporate governance to get information. So you can draw on the information to inform the action that happens at the works council. That's an example of a complementarity. To give you another example, the Ghent system, right? The Ghent system supports unionization through helping unions get members through by administering unemployment insurance, but their broad rights to industrial action are supported by that as well. It's the presence of multiple forms of institutional power that can help them to scale up. But there are contradictions as well. And Anke Hassel has talked about this too. Sometimes an institutional power resource can actually reduce power over time. So in Germany, there's the question of institutional security. Some people say the fact that the institutions were so strong which was the reason why unions mobilized less associational power than they should have in many instances. In Sweden, unions are worried about exploiting their powers to industrial action out of fear that if they get too aggressive with strike action, it might provoke its regulation. So there's contradictions as well. Having a power can actually lead to a decline of power over time if you are not careful, which leads to something else that's important. Agency effects. Agency effects have to do with, you have all these contradictions, you have these direct, indirect effects, you have these complementarity effects, and it's important that you can have smart strategic choices and that you can use these power resources effectively. There's a difference if you're, for example, sectoral bargaining, there's a lot of research to show that it's more effective under social movement unionism rather than business unionism. That's just a quick example of strategic choices, because I don't know where I'm at for time, but I feel like I've been going on. 5 minutes, d'accord. So union capabilities are also very important. I've got myself in there for articulation, but of course we draw on Christian and Gregor's wonderful work on union capabilities in the paper too. But articulation is if you're going to have complementarity effects, and there's different institutions that can work together, you need to have the unions have to have the ability to work across them. And that's an example, but there's tons of capabilities that are important. Do you have a cognitive understanding of your institutional context? Can you draw on them effectively? And these are all different examples. And just to show, there's one example here that I talk about with the Ghent system, and I already talked about it a bit, which shows how there's multiple effects. There's complexity to understanding how unions can draw on one given institution over time. And the Ghent system in the Nordic countries and Belgium, it can help a lot of things. One thing, it gives unions a direct influence over unemployment insurance because they're involved in its administration. But it also indirectly supports union recruitment, which is necessary to build associational power. So there's an indirect effect there. And it helps them to maintain structural power as well, because the Ghent system is very important to supporting sectoral bargaining. If you didn't have sectoral bargaining in these countries, goodbye structural power that you enjoy that enables you to have gains over time in bargaining. Complementarities are important. Like strike rights are very, very strong, very important to industrial action in these countries, right? They're famous for their sympathy strikes where they can implicate all these different unions into a battle with one or multiple employers in ways that you don't see in a lot of countries, especially in North America. But this wouldn't be possible if they didn't have the Ghent system that supported union density. But again, like I mentioned before, there's a contradiction. Unions can be reliant on it. And you see when there's neoliberal reforms, it can hit them in terms of density. So when you rely on it and you're not actually engaging in member organizing, the strength you had from it made you disinvest in certain areas that created problems down the road. Strategic choices are important and union capabilities are important. And I won't go into it too much so that I don't run out of time, but that's just to show you that there's complexity. There's a new section that we're working on now, which is about the contested regimes of institutional power usage. And we talk about the different functions of institutional power, like setting the rules of the game, voice, union security, standard setting, decommodification, and the welfare state. And we argue that these are contested by multiple actors, not only what constitutes an institutional power, but how it is used. And for example, we'll talk about shifting fault lines. If, for example, standard setting, the more the state gets involved in standard setting, the less space it gives for unions. But some also say it boasts unions' ability to negotiate. So there's constantly shifted, contested regimes, and we're still working on that one. But if you have any questions on what we can do theoretically about it, and then we do have a section on origins of institutional power. We talk about how they often come through social compromises, class compromises that take place through important events, but sometimes they're introduced by happenstance. They're just kind of neutral entities, and you don't even realize how important they are till later on. Like the Ghent system, the unions didn't even want the Ghent system when it was first introduced. It just became important over time, and it makes them really strong because of how they've used it and how it's evolved, but it was not a union idea. Unions didn't push hard for it in Sweden. So that's important. Of course, we talk about the trends in neoliberalism, marketization, declines in organized labor, ideational shifts, and discuss different hypotheses for change. But finally, this is just to say that there are some benefits to digging deeper into institutional power. Shifts institutions to the background, from the background to the foreground of debates on power resources and collective action. Ton of the major discussions are about associational power. but we need to focus on the other power resources too and unpack how they matter. It acknowledges the limits of collective action and makes you think about what is a strong union. It's not always the union that can get people together. We need to really understand how institutions fit into the picture to really understand the nature of union strength. And it's paradoxical because sometimes a union is very not strong at what unions typically do, member organizing and representation, but the institutions prop them up. And it helps escape tensions between structure and agency, because it's not only a question of institutions are there and you do it, but you have to be able to use them. And it adds value to debates on how power resources interact by implicating everything in the picture. That's it, I'm done.